Hi everyone, I'm Mark Ronson, I'm the head of program here at Tortoise, and tonight I'm very excited to be talking to our guest, Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran. And at the risk of sounding like a local radio DJ, that track you just heard was Anniversary from Duran Duran's latest album, Future Past, there we are, which comes available in a rather snazzy coloured vinyl. Other formats are available. And yeah, so this is a thinking where we're going to get to talk to Nick. We're going to talk about the future of music. We're going to talk about Duran Duran as a band, the impact it's had on the music business. We're going to talk about fans. We're going to talk a little bit about Andy Warhol. We're going to talk about pop videos. But I guess the most important thing is that this is your chance to kind of get involved. So don't forget to post your questions, comments, and opinions in the chat. My colleague Liz, who is a Duran Duran super fan, is running the chat tonight. Yeah, so let's crack on. So Nick, hi, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
So I'm really enjoying Future Past, and I say that as someone who's I'm a fan of Duran Duran, but I've followed the music more than I've followed the band. So I sort of dipped in and out of it over the years, and certain singles have caught my ear, and then I've gone and found out more about them. But this is, I mean, this is incredible, I think. There's a confidence and an energy to it, which is really refreshing. And so just tell us a little bit about how it came about, because it's got quite an interesting sort of birth, hasn't it?
Yeah, we tend to go through the process of writing some songs, making an album, putting the album out, promoting the album, going on a tour, taking a little break, then doing the same thing again. And that's gone on for about 4 decades now. At the beginning, it was a very fast process. When you're kids, you're teenagers, you've got a lot of ideas that you've been storing up, that you have to get out there as quickly as possible and almost feel like you're in a race to get heard and to establish yourself. I think as your career moves on and people's lives become inevitably more complex with families, children, different responsibilities, older parents, houses, whatever all the things are, your focus starts to shift slightly and you take longer to do things. It seems almost unbelievable that it's 5 years, almost 6 years since we last released a Duran Duran album, which was called Paper Gods. But finally, we made it with Future Past. The reason that the period was so long is that we did a lot of touring, and then we took a little break, not that long, and then began recording in 2018, late 2018, on Future Past in London. We all got in a room together with, along with guitarist Graham Coxon, who many of you may know from Blur. He was in the writing room with us, and producer Erol Alkan, who's from a more DJ and dance floor background, although he's produced some indie bands too. We just thought he was an interesting energy to have in the room. And we all just start playing and recording. And through 2018, all through 2019, we thought we'd pretty much got the album. By early 2020, we had 15 tracks or whatever it was, and thought, nah, we just got to tweak a few things, finish it off. Then, of course, the pandemic struck, and we had to put the album on ice for, well, good 9 to 10 months. So we returned to it in about March of this year and opened the doors to the vaults, went in and thought, well, what do we have? Do we still like it? Is it the same thing that we thought it was 10 months ago? And fortunately, it was in pretty good shape. And what the time away had done was enabled us to all stand back a bit and look down upon the whole thing with fresh eyes and fresh ears too, to listen and to get in and literally see clearly what needed to be fixed. So in a funny way, it did us a favor to have a break. We'd never had a break during a recording of an album ever before of more than a couple of weeks here and a couple of weeks there. And the focus was really clear, and we finished it in about another 2 months worth of work. A lot of that was lyric work. And of course, it's just literally been launched last week.
So it's fair to say that one of the silver linings of the pandemic was a cracking Duran Duran album. I'll take that. I mean, the collaborators that you worked with on this and on recent albums, it's an incredible list of people. I mean, you've already mentioned Graham Coxon, but I know you've worked with Mark Ronson quite a lot. Tove Lo is on this album. And I think you worked with Giorgio Moroder. He's involved as well, isn't he, on that? I mean, and in the past, sorry, you've worked with Khalees, Avatronic, who's been on Tortoise before, Justin Timberlake, Nile Rodgers. How do those come about? Are you sat in a room thinking, has anyone got Giorgio Moroder's number? Let's just get him on the phone.
Yeah, we did have his number. I'd met him at lunch. Giorgio Moroder particularly, I have my partner, Nefa, to thank for that. She's Italian, and we were in Los Angeles, California, a few years back, and she had a mutual friend who knew Giorgio and thought for my birthday it'd be fun to go to lunch with Giorgio. So we did. And we had a long chat and said, how on earth haven't we worked together? Because it would seem like quite a natural combination, Giorgio Moroder and Duran Duran. And we just couldn't figure it out, how we'd never really crossed paths, and we agreed to try and do something. And then a few years later, we managed to pull it together when we were in the studio. I mean, he's remarkable. You're talking about a guy who's got a shelf full of Oscars here, who's still as sharp as ever, and working. If you think of what he's responsible for, I Feel Love by Donna Summer, the track that he produced, for me is the singular most important track that pivoted dance music, electronic dance music, into the future. It tipped it into a different direction, and many, many other things. So that was how Giorgio came about, really sort of half by accident, but by design, in that we'd wanted to work with him forever. Mark Ronson, we've worked with on and off many years. He's just on one track on this album. But we love working with Mark dearly. He's a fantastic, inspirational musician, a great talent. He can play almost anything. He says he can't, but he picks up guitars, and then he'll pick up a keyboard and play drums for a while. And he's pretty good at them, but he's got great taste. I think that's one of the things with making music. Just like everything else in life, you need to have similar taste to really make something work. And Mark had been a fan of the band for a long time, and we loved what he was doing. So it just all worked together. Someone like Tove Lo is a very different story. Sorry, I think you get to a point where you say, right, we've got this song, we quite like a female voice on it. Who would fit? Who might be up for it? Who do we like? And who can we contact? You can ultimately usually get people somehow through their management or PR or whatever it is, but it's choosing the people that you hope will be up for the idea. And Tove Lo, we sent the track to Give It All Up, and she loved it and came back with something that I think elevated the song enormously.
And are there any on the list of, the ones who got away or that you haven't managed to do something with yet? But
I think there always are, aren't there? Whatever you do, there's always people you'd like to meet or you would like to work with. I don't know specifically, really. I think we all admire some of the younger artists now. The Weeknd, I think, is very clever. I really like those records. They're great pop records, great dance songs. Billie Eilish recently, I think her first album was spectacularly good for someone so young too, and she's got a great energy. We were just watching at this festival we played in Austin, Texas. We were watching Doja Cat, who's another new hot favorite. Everybody likes her, but it could be anyone. Look, we also worked with David Bowie's pianist for many years, Mike Garson, on this album, who's one of our sort of great heroes from when we were kids. That was extraordinary too.
I mean, one of the things that you're known for is as well, you sort of push the boundaries in video. You know, it was a medium that you were sort of at the forefront of experimenting with when it was sort of pretty nascent, still in the early 80s. And I know one of the videos for Future Past has been directed by AI. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, that was an interesting thing to do. It's a song Invisible, which was the first track we released from the album. It was actually our manager, Wendy Leister, who is forward thinking and always got a lot of ideas to contribute to. She said, I've been talking to this group called Nested Minds. And she said, they're really interesting. I think you're going to like them. They all studied under a famous neuroscientist called Carl Friston. And they became computer programmers. And they've come at it from a very different angle, which I found appealing, in that instead of trying to program a computer in a cognitive way, which is what we would normally do, they based their programming and the input on developing the AI on the neurological patterns of the human brain and upon how we process things in the creative side of the mind. So decisions that we make that are more abstract about color, shape, and also it's the part of the brain that dreams. Mm. So you sort of got this dreaming machine, an AI called Huxley, which also I rather liked. And Huxley was fed all this information, some obvious things like the lyric of the song and images of us and images of us mouthing the words so that it could measure our faces and make its own versions of us, and lots of imagery that we sort of liked, that we thought fitted around the song. And it took it all in, mashed it all together, and literally made its own decisions about what images it thought fitted with the song. It was fascinating. It was pumping out at one time 20, 30,000 images overnight. And we get them the next day in these massive files online. And we just look at them and say, what has it done? Extraordinary. Sometimes you'd get a tree that turned into a person, that turned into a dog, that turned into a car, that really as surreal as you could ever imagine. If we'd given it to the world's most surreal artist, I don't think it would have come back with anything more unusual and unique than this.
That's completely extraordinary. I mean, we do a lot on AI here at Tortoise, and we've had multiple AI summits. There's one coming up in December, and I'd probably pay more attention to them if they've talked about AI dreaming machines, because that's such a lovely way to think of it. Is video still important? Are pop videos still important?
I don't know. I don't know how important they are in the grand scale of the world, but for sure, in pop music, in rock music, in hip hop, yes, I think videos are an important tool of communication. We've all got used to seeing artists. It's no longer enough to just hear something on the radio when you don't connect visually, I suppose. I remember when we first did videos, some of the older artists, the more established artists, were really unhappy about it. And they didn't want to make videos. They thought it was all wrong. What's that got to do with music? Music's all about writing the songs, putting out the records and performing them live. It's got nothing to do with making a fancy film to go with your song. But that sort of changed throughout the 80s. And for us, obviously, we embraced the format, thinking that it was a good opportunity to do something artistic too. That's why making a video with an AI is appealing to me, or the most recent one we made with the artist Alison Jackson, who's done a lot of things with lookalikes and satirical photos. So yes, I think they are. I think they are important to artists.
I'm going to bring in one of our members, Ruth Galvin, who's got an interesting question about collective inattention. Ruth.
Hi, Nick. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I just had a question on that point about video. So I suppose the collective inattention that people have when, as John Taylor recently said, I think it was in his Forbes interview, that everyone's scrolling through Instagram while they're listening to music. And even things like, say, you know, the kind of decline of physical media, how important cover art is, how important video is. Does that collective inattention, does that inspire you a little bit more? Because I suppose if you look at Duran Duran's latest efforts with AI Huxley, with the More Joy anime video, with the Yokota album artwork, you know, and with the satire of the anniversary video, they're all very imaginative. They're all just when you're developing audiovisual concepts, do you have that in mind, or do you just put it out there and hope for the best?
Well, we've always found visual imagery, whether it's still photos or videos or how the live performance looks, even TV performances we might do, we look at every aspect of it to see how we might improve it, how it will make the visual experience better. Now, whether that's hair and makeup, whether it's lighting, whether it's a set design, or whether it's simply the best idea we can come up with for a video concept. They're all important. Same thing with the album cover. John Taylor and I really drove this one in particular, and usually it's the two of us that are, there it is, making the decisions about what direction things should go, but the other band members are also interested to make sure we're all comfortable with the overall output that we use. Regarding the new sort of short attention span that I think we do have out there in the world, you have to sort of weigh up how much you want to play to that. It's not something that I particularly am keen on encouraging, but I don't dislike the idea that we get things quickly in sound bites either. I think that's fine. I like the idea of Instagram for imagery and scrolling through things, and I like the idea of Twitter for people's comments on different matters. But at the same time, I still like to think in rather bigger chunks. So when we make songs, I don't think of, oh, let's put out one song and then we'll put out another one 6 months later. We still thought of this project as a whole album. And that probably does come from being a kid growing up, loving the vinyl format and picking up the record and putting on side two. That whole ritual has sort of stuck with me. I love the convenience of digital. And of course, I use streaming services too to listen to music. But I feel that when you create something for musical artists, still the best format we have is the album. And I feel videos sort of work too for each song. And your album cover is important. We learned that from the best, from David Bowie and the Rolling Stones, who always had incredible album covers throughout the 70s. And you know, when a new Rolling Stones album came out, it wasn't necessarily that I was going to rush out to buy that one, as I wasn't as big a fan then as perhaps I am now. But I always loved the covers when you first saw something that Andy Warhol had done for them. And it's powerful. I think when artists can work with other artists too, often something really interesting and unusual comes out of that.
And thank you for that, Ruth. So it's interesting, you talked about kind of video back in the 80s. And one of the things that I was curious to sort of start talking about was the longevity of Duran Duran. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like most bands, they go through a period of discovery, which for some is overnight and for others takes a bit longer. And then they go through a period of success, which for some lasts about a week, but for others it lasts for many years. And then things kind of stop. And not one of four things can happen. One is the band goes their separate ways and they split up. They hit a nostalgia circuit, which is probably commercially quite lucrative, but artistically not very rewarding. There's the big in Japan route. and then a handful go on for like a sort of second act. And there's not many people, there are not many bands, I think, that fall into that category, but good examples would be the Stones, would be Fleetwood Mac, The Cure. And actually, I'll let my colleague Matt Dancona, who's Tortoise's resident culture vulture, put the question better than I can. Matt, I know you've got a thing about longevity.
Well, yes. Sadly, I personify it now these days. But it's great to see you, Nick. Thanks for doing this. And another thing I am is a lifelong, almost lifelong Duran Duran fan. I remember first seeing the band in, I think, November 1980 at the Marquee, and then a bunch of other. I've seen the band so many times since, including the famous Dominion gig in 1983, and it, it's just. To use the terrible cliche, the soundtrack to my life. But the interesting thing that Mark was talking about that I'd love to ask you about is when the music started and the first two albums were so powerful, so new, so electrifying. But we were also, they were pop albums, and pop by definition is ephemeral, and the imagery in the Rio videos was of glamour and consumption and so on. But what's interesting looking back now is thinking of your influences and Bowie, and you mentioned the Stones and Roxy, of course. I mean, did you ever have time to think about time frames, or were you just so busy? I mean, was it if someone had said to you, hey, you know what, you'll not only will you keep going, but in 2021, you'll produce one of the best albums you've ever produced, or even in 1993, you'll produce what became known as the wedding album with the song like Ordinary World on it that completely reconfigures the way you see the band and its scale. If someone had said that to you, would it have struck you all as absolutely ridiculous, or actually we'll take that, we'll have that, what a nice idea, we will stick together and we will produce a body of work?
Well, Matthew, I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm also a realist. And I think that I could certainly say without any doubt that when we started, none of us could have imagined that the band would go on for more than a few years. If you look at what we had as examples, the Sex Pistols, who were incredibly important to us, being that they were the first bands, along with the other punk bands, with the Clash and the Damned and Susie and the Banshees, and they showed us that it was possible to get on a stage, not know too much technically, musically, play a few chords, write a decent song, and be able to do it at an early age. They were only a few years older than us, and we were going to see them in clubs and watching transfixed. But the Sex Pistols lasted their career, I think, in entirety was just over 2 years. And if you looked at the Beatles, who were the gold standard, their career lasted, 9 years? 8-9 years. They were finished by 1970. So really thinking that the greatest band the world had ever had lasted for about 8 to 9 years, that was probably our life expectancy on the optimistic side. I think what we did do is we went with all the force we had because we didn't know how long it would last for. We were incredibly ambitious teenagers with blinkers on that blanked out any kind of possibility of failure. And without that pure naivete, I'm not sure how many bands would ever make it. You've got to believe, and you've got to just carry on and not look back or not worry that it can go wrong. There wasn't a plan B. And so we just kept moving and kept moving and kept moving. We got to 5 years, which was around the time Wild Boys had just come out and done very well. And then A View to a Kill came out. And that was the last song with the original 5-piece lineup, because by then we just completely burnt each other out. and people, the demands from the record labels and everybody just saying, give us more hits, please, just feed us some more. It was too much. And so it really did sort of implode at that point. And hence we sort of split the atom and did Power Station Arcadia. And then when we came back together, there was only 3 of us, because Roger just had enough, the drummer. He wanted to just step out of music for a while. And Andy, the guitarist, had completely gone the other way and moved to Los Angeles with the belief that he was going to have a big solo career on his own. He didn't need anything else. And so that's what 5 years did to us. After that, somehow the 3 of us pieced it together for the Notorious album, made our way through the next 35 years. But would I have expected that? No, of course not.
Because what's really interesting is the easy option for the longevity is to patch up your differences and to become your own tribute band.
Right.
So you tour the world just doing the greatest hits with a couple of tracks from the new album to keep the record company happy. And that is conspicuously not what you've done. You know, you've continued to turn out new stuff. So again, it's just interesting to know, was it, you know, of course you'll play the hits, but you know, we are going to keep producing new exploratory music. That's the point.
That's what drives us. For me, I'm not really interested in nostalgia, and I don't want that to sound disingenuous. Of course, I'm very happy to play songs that we've written over the last 4 decades in the live show. And if I went to a show and I didn't see some of the songs that I wanted to see from artists, I'd be disappointed. So I understand that aspect of it. But regarding new material, that's the lifeblood for us. It's what excites us, because in a way, playing a show for a couple of hours, if you can play 20 minutes of new music in that, so 4 or 5 songs that are new, that the audience will stick with you and give you that attention or patience or whatever, because they're happy to receive the rest sometimes, that's great. But if they'll actually stick with you and they really like the new stuff too, that's a triumph.
Yeah.
So that's what we're always aiming for. And you know, sometimes you're enormously successful with that, and other times, of course, not. But there's always the joke. People always say, "Oh, and here's a new song," and everybody goes to the bar. But we try to do that.
But so that's really interesting, Nick, because there must come a point where you get all your mates together, you form a band, and it's, you know, I guess in the early days it's a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, and everything else. But there must be that point as well where the band becomes a business, and does that change anything? And at what point did that happen in like the Duran Duran timeline?
Well, a band is always a business. It's not maybe a particularly attractive way for musicians to present themselves. But unfortunately, if you have absolutely no business sense whatsoever, it's much harder to survive. We were quite lucky on my personal behalf. My parents both were self-employed and worked all of their lives, and I understood the basic premises of what needed to be done and what responsibilities there were. I do wish that I had understood more about contractual law, and I think it's utterly immoral what happens to a lot of young artists when they sign these contracts at the age of 18, 19, 20 and have no clue what it really means to give up your publishing rights in perpetuity on certain songs for a very small amount. So that side of it, you learn the hard way. And we learned the same way that the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Elton John learned. I wish we'd known more. So I always say to younger artists now, the best advice I could give you is make sure that you do understand things properly.
And how do you protect?
It's harder to survive if you run out of money. You burn through all your cash on your first album and your tour. Think you're doing really well. It's all coming in. Then suddenly you get the bill and you say, "Oh, actually, we've spent it."
And how do you protect and nurture the relationships within the band to make sure that the band is still a band? You know, with all those outside pressures, the money and the demands from the record label and everything else. Because the thing that, you know, part of the magic of Duran Duran and other bands is the sort of X factor that comes from the chemistry of the members of it, right? So obviously, you know, there are personnel changes over the years, and you have to kind of manage that as well and bring new people into the fold and manage the departure of others. There was that bit in the mid-2000s where everyone was called Taylor. Like, how do you sort of manage that kind of relationship aspect of it?
I think most of it is really down to respect.
Right.
If you work with people, and in our case, want to work with people, we chose each other, then you have to be tolerant, and you really have to understand a lot of psychology too, about when someone's in a really bad mood or hasn't had any sleep or is missing their family or I don't know, stayed up too late, whatever the reasons might be. It happens to all of us at different degrees each day. And yes, you have to manage it. You have to be able to focus on the more important issues, for us being creativity. So it might be that I'm really not happy with Simon about something on some day, but I still know that when we get into the studio, we'll make everything fall into place, and I'll forget about whatever it was that I was unhappy about, probably some email that he'd fired off and not thought about what the repercussions were. Or we have a lot of decisions to make in the band. The email trails that travel every single day of the year about whether we're going to do this or what we've been offered to do that on a TV show or a live show, or whether we want to license a song on something. Every single thing comes over our desks, if you like. And we make those decisions very, very carefully, because I do think that your presentation is important. So the four of us have to be pretty much locked in. In many ways, we're a democracy that truly does work, which sounds like a bit of a contradiction, I know, but it does work somehow.
So talking of forming bands, I think this is a good time to bring in Virginia Taylor, who's in the room, I believe. Virginia, I mean, sounds like you've got a great story. Do you want to share that with the room? Or you might need to unmute yourself. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, which story is that?
How you formed a band because of a certain other.
Yes. Well, I got into Duran Duran through The Reflex. That was the first song that I heard of Duran Duran, which was brilliant, Nick. And my auntie actually said, yeah, The Reflex, that's a good song. Yeah, I said, okay, I'll have that. So I put it on my turntable when I got home, and it hadn't left my turntable until 2 weeks later when my dad got me Seven and Ragged Tiger. So that was really good. So thank you very much. And I got to know about how you formed the band and how you felt, you and John, going to punk concerts and seeing Roxy Music, seeing Nick Rhodes, and realizing that, oh, I only need to learn 3 chords and then I could form a band. And I read all those interviews about how you got Duran Duran together. I thought, oh, okay, I might just pick up a guitar. And then I had to find like-minded people within my school, within my vicinity. And that's how I formed my first band when I was 15. So thank you for that. I'm still in a band. I've been in lots of bands over the years. And
the current band. Quick plug.
So, well, my current band is kind of poppy power punk. That's how they have described us in certain press. Sorry?
What's it called?
It's called the Priscillas.
Okay. So on the subject, thank you, Virginia. So on the subject of artistic inspirations, I didn't know this until I sort of delved into sort of kind of like your history, Nick. But I didn't realize that you kind of got to hang out with Andy Warhol at Factory in New York, which is extraordinary to me. I never knew that. Can you just tell us a little bit about Andy Warhol and what it was like to meet him?
It was one of those funny stories, but we couldn't wait to get to New York. As kids, John and I were obsessed with Iggy Pop and David Bowie and Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground and Andy Warhol and the Empire State Building and everything that came out of New York. There was a magazine called Rock Scene that was done by a journalist called Lisa Robinson, who I later got to know, but this was like our Bible that would arrive at the newsagents in Birmingham, and we'd try and get it every month. So going to New York for us was the biggest deal, the most exciting thing that had happened to us in our lives at that point. I think when I went there, I was probably 19. Anyway, we arrive, and there's a promo lady called Doreen D'Agostino, who I remember very well. Of course, she became known as Doreen. And she said to us, "What would you guys like to do when you're in New York City?" So rather flippantly, I said, "Well, I'd love to go up the Empire State Building and go to meet Andy Warhol, please." Just really not even thinking that there was any possibility of either of those things happening, because I didn't even know you could go up the Empire State Building. And anyway, so she says, "Okay, sure thing." Yeah, she's just humoring me. And the next day, I get a call in the morning, and she says, "Well, can you be down for noon?" And I said, "But I thought it was our day off. I was going to go for a walk and go shopping." And she said, "But you told me you wanted to go up the Empire State Building and to meet Andy Warhol." And I thought, is she joking? And she said, "Well, we're going to go up the Empire State Building. Then I've organized for you to go to lunch at the Factory." And a couple of the other guys said they'd like to come along too. I said, "Okay." So I put on my best blue and white striped t-shirt, and that was that. Went downstairs, and sure enough, I went up the Empire State Building, and then we all met up and went to the Factory to meet Andy, which was very surreal because it was just as you'd seen things. It was the later Factory. It was the one on Union Square, so it wasn't the very first one. But I'd seen images, and there was Bridget behind the desk, and Fred Hughes was there, and it was just quite surreal. But Andy was fantastic, and of course, I'm sure he was excited that there was this new young band from the UK in New York, and it was fun. He took lots of pictures and wanted to show us things, and gave us copies of his book. And I got along with him. So my address book at the time sort of had Auntie Linda and Uncle George and Andy Warhol. So I every time I got to New York, I didn't really know anyone there. I was 19 years old, and Andy would just take me everywhere and just introduce me to people and say, "Hey, this is Debbie Harry, this is Stephen Sprouse, this is Jean-Michel Basquiat, Francesco Clemente." So I owe Andy a great debt for opening up my world at that point and introducing me to some people that have become lifelong friends, and of course, many that sadly are no longer with us. But it was an incredible time in New York through that period, because you had these remarkable nightclubs like Area and Studio 54, and then the Palladium, and Danceteria and the Peppermint Lounge. I could go on and on and on, Xenon, and all these late night places. And you also had this incredible art scene really, if you think about who came out of that period there with Julian Schnabel and Francesco Clemente and Keith Haring and Warhol and Robert Mapplethorpe and all these different people, it was really the most exciting place in the world to be. So we spent an awful lot of time in New York after that first visit.
Do you think that kind of collision of art, fashion, music, film, do you think that still happens today? Because I get the sense they sort of carry on in their own individual continuums now.
I think it does cross over a little bit. You see things, you see different people doing things for Louis Vuitton musicians, but I don't know that it's as organic as it was then. There was this sort of will in the early 80s where we all wanted to mix everything up together. I mean, I never thought of Duran Duran as being a band. It was more a sort of an arts collective for me. Who do we get to work with? What fashion designers are we going to work with? What photographers? What graphic designers? That was part of the package, that we were going to be different like that. And obviously we took things from all our influences, Kraftwerk and Sparks and David Bowie and Roxy Music. So it had come from a clear pathway, but there was no way we were ever going to be going on stage wearing jeans and t-shirts.
I'm going to go to Maya Garcia, if I can, next, because I think she's got quite an interesting question. Hello, Maya.
Hi, how are you, Nick? Thank you so much for having us, and thanks for taking the time out. So I'm guessing it was the question about what would you tell your younger self, right?
That's right.
Okay, so yeah, Nick, if you could go back in time, what would you say to your 18-year-old self?
Well, probably the things that I would say would stop him of doing what he actually did get to do. So I'm not sure it would have been good advice. I'd probably have said, well, don't take as many chances with that. Be a bit more careful. When you get older, you tend to take a few less risks. But I always push myself as much as I can still to take risks, because otherwise it becomes too safe and too dull. What's interesting about bands to me is they're a little bit more dangerous, because you never know what's going to happen and when things are going to go wrong and when someone's going to throw a guitar against the wall or whatever it might be. The best advice I could have given myself was to understand contracts better. As I was just saying a little earlier in the conversation, I think that's the ruination of a lot of great artists, that they haven't understood what things are and what finances they have available to do things, and whether they're making money when they go on tour, just to even get them to the next record. So I think a little more knowledge in that would have been very helpful.
Oh, thanks for the question, Maya. Nick, your comment about Duran Duran as an arts collective has inspired quite a lot of activity in the chat. So I'm going to bring in Rachel Ems, if I can. Hi, Rachel.
Hi there. Hi, Nick. Yeah, I was just interested in your comment about you always saw the band as being an arts collective rather than a band. And yet at the same time, you were on the walls of lots of teenagers' bedrooms. So in your head, how did you align that ambition of yours to do something a bit more experimental with the fact that you were essentially a teenage heartthrob?
That's a very fair question. It was not anything that we ever really expected. We started out very much as sort of an arts band, if you like. We came out of a club scene, particularly the Rum Runner in Birmingham, and it was quite exotic. We were playing songs like Waiting for the Night Boat and a lot of songs with slightly darker lyrics, songs like Careless Memories, which is a proper sort of post-punk song. And then we started to realize when we were on tour supporting the artist Hazel O'Connor, that people were screaming and that there was young girls in the audience. This seemed completely unexpected. I mean, truly a shock. But at the same time, we thought, wow, oh, this is interesting. Okay, so we're getting a different type of audience than we had till now, because it was very much a cliquey underground club audience. But actually, there's a lot more of them, and they make a lot of noise, and it's quite exciting, because when you've got that kind of level of audience noise, although sometimes you could hardly hear yourself play, there is something that is electric about the atmosphere. And then we started to think about it a little more, and I guess being familiar with footage of the Beatles and the Stones and the Doors, that all had that similar reaction with teenage girls in particular, we reconciled it to that and thought, well, hey, if it was okay for John Lennon and Jim Morrison, it's got to be okay for us. And as we moved on through the years, we became increasingly grateful and accepting of our audience, because you don't pick your audience picks you. And you should always be grateful to have an audience. And those teenage girls are pretty much stuck with us, which is kind of extraordinary. How many people are still around with us now? And that's the other reason we're still around, is because we have an audience. If the audience had gone away, then I don't know how we would have made the thing work. So yeah, that's really what happened. But we continued to make the music we wanted to make, and some of it was more pop, which we also like. I always think of pop as the Beatles, and some of it was more experimental. But that seemed to sit okay on the album, the balance.
And is there ever a conversation where, you know, you're looking at a track or a collection of tracks, and is there ever a conversation where you go, yeah, the fans aren't going to go for this?
No.
And then you think about how you might bring them with you.
No, you can't do that. I say you can't. I'm sure maybe some people can. We can't do that. It's just, it's not in our nature. We just make things and have to let them happen. The way that they happen is if everybody's excited. When we get into a studio or a rehearsal room, we're all playing together. It's interesting. I think that is something we have learned to do a lot better with practice and time, is that we zero in on what is the strongest element. So it might be a phrase that Simon's singing over and over. It might be some keyboard chords that I'm playing. It might just be the rhythm of the bass and drums that we're all drawn to. But we gravitate towards the strongest element in the room. And it doesn't matter if that's something really abstract or something that sounds potentially like a big commercial hit. We instinctively know that we like the sound of it, and that could make a Duran Duran song. And so we just have to follow through with that and hope that we get enough things that appeal to people.
I want to get a bit nerdy, if I can, just for a few minutes. And looking back from the outside, it looks like pretty much every decade there's a sort of game-changing technical innovation in music. So 70s, it's the keyboard synth. 80s, it's the 808 drum machine. The 90s, you've got, you know, MIDI sequencers and digital music. What's happening right now that's got you really excited, or that you're really interested in?
Well, AI.
Yeah.
Which, as we talked about, we use for video. I also think AI will be interesting for music, but it's a double-edged sword to see how far you want to allow a machine to go. But I quite like the idea of where that's going to take us. I think the internet is the thing that's changed most in the entire time. And people having the ability to just have instant access to a song anywhere at any time around the world. You know, in 1997, I pushed the button on the world's first download that was ever sold. So around the same time as Napster. And I did this at Abbey Road in London. And it took 6 more years to launch iTunes, which was 2003. I had endless arguments with record labels, particularly our label, about how the industry should approach downloading, and that we must seize the opportunity to use this extraordinary, incredible new technology to make songs available, not try and smash it up. And it's sort of, their attitude really reminded me of the people we all learn about at school in England, the Luddites. Because it really was break the machinery and stop them now, stop the progress. But there was no stopping it. And Apple were the people that were smart enough. And it took them 6 years because they were developing the device at the same time as the technology to put the songs up on iTunes. And that was incredibly smart. And we know what happened. But I do think there are things that come out with technology that really help change things. I think voice activated programming will be something that'll be the next generation too, because that's really starting to get a lot better. And there's all kinds of new effects and things, but not as significant as the sort of things you're talking about.
And just very quickly, briefly then, you mentioned, well, the types of technologies we have now in the internet, you can record anywhere. Has that spelt the end of the legendary recording studio, like Abbey Road, like Trident, like Psalm? Like, are they a relic now of past?
Well, no, I hope not. Of course, you're completely right. You can record in a basement with a computer anywhere, or a phone box if you can find one. But I still feel there will be a need for studios, just like vinyl has had a resurgence. I think people understand there are some advantages. If you're recording live music, for sure, you need a studio. If you want to record a 70-piece orchestra, they don't fit in so many people's bedrooms, and you want that ambient sound around it that you can only get in great rooms like Abbey Road, or Air Studios in Hampstead in London has a wonderful room for orchestras. So yes, I think there are things, and I love old school gear. So we still use outboard gear from the 70s and the 80s and a few things from the 90s, because that technology has all been reproduced digitally, but it is nowhere near as good as the original analog technology. I take a lot of photographs. I now take many more digital photographs, but I have to say, when I looked at some of my digital photos versus the old school 35mm photos a few weeks ago, it was sort of heartbreaking, because it doesn't matter how many filters and things you put on top, which are now getting to be super sophisticated, it's still not got the depth and the grain that you really want. Pixels are square, grain on 35mm are little tiny dots. It's different.
So we've got a question from Saundra Fried? There we are. Hi, Saundra. I know you've got a question about how albums are put together. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Nick. As a contracts lawyer who's been a Duran fan since Hungry Like the Wolf on MTV, it's really great to talk with you. I'm just wondering, a lot of us Duranis feel that some of the bonus tracks should be album tracks, and so I'm wondering how the band decides what makes the cut, because a lot of us would make the cut differently.
Sure. That's perfectly understandable. I don't disagree with you, by the way. For example, on our last album, Paper Gods, there was a track that Simon and I were arguing over until the bitter end. And when we finally agreed, he gave in, by the way, and agreed to my version. But it isn't always that way. It was too late to put it on the album, and it ended up being a bonus track. So it is a difficult process. Often it's because we're being hurried to get an album completed, and we can get 12 of the mixes done, and the other 3 or 4 or whatever's left aren't done in time. That's another reason. With this album, it was down to choosing the mood of it. And I think what we really try to base it on is how the experience works for side A and side B. We do still think like that about vinyl. And of course, how it works for even a CD, or how it works for someone who just does play it in the complete order online, streaming it. So there's different criteria. So for the 12-track album, for example, which doesn't have the bonus tracks, that for us as a band, the four of us, when we made the decisions, along with the producers, felt like the right running order. And there was a couple of songs we liked equally to some of the ones included, but they didn't sort of fit in the jigsaw the same way. It might have been because of the key of them or the tempo of them, or that it was a little too similar in harmonic sound to one of the other tracks. It's quite a lot of criteria. But then when we went to put together the long version of the album with all the bonus tracks, we slotted them in where we felt they were best on the journey. And in fact, it gets even more complicated because the Japanese always want one more track than everybody else. And so we had to add another one, which was our version of the David Bowie song, 5 Years. And that's on that album. So that's really all 16 of everything. And again, that one was slotted in carefully. It's a process. I'm sure it's very different with all bands, but it's a lot of arguing.
There's been a lot of talk about that question in the chat throughout the thinking, so I'm glad that we got to that. Nick, we've just got a few minutes left. I am nothing if not thorough in preparing for these. So when I knew that I was going to be talking to you, I went to Quora online and tapped in Duran Duran just to see the types of questions that the internet is asking. And there was a couple of things I think it might be useful to clear up for the world. So the first one is, what does Duran Duran mean in Turkish?
Wow. For me, anything you like, I'm afraid, because I have no idea, but I'd love to know the answer.
So a popular answer was it means to pause, to wait, apparently. Another question, was Johnny Depp in Duran Duran? Can you clear that up?
No, he wasn't in Duran Duran. I'm sure that he would have fit the bill in some ways early on. He was actually a friend of Simon's brother. I think is probably where some of this came from. I think they both lived together in Florida for a while around the time, in the very early days of the band.
And Duran Duran had a hit song about a wolf. What was it called?
No idea.
And I guess, so where are we now? Oh, this is actually the end of our hour. So I need to thank all of our amazing audience for all the great contributions tonight, all the great activity in the chat. I should say that this is part of our KITE branded ThinkIn series, which is to promote KITE Festival next year, which is this amazing festival of music and ideas on the 11th and 12th of June. Full lineup to be announced in about 2 weeks. Tickets on sale in about 2 weeks. And now I sound like a local radio DJ again. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope to see you again soon, maybe for real in the newsroom.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll play out with Anniversary, I think, again from the album. We'll do another quick product shot. There we are. Do buy it. And thanks very much. Have a good night.
Everyone, it was a pleasure. Thank you.